Is it possible to love a video game if you dislike its concept? Over the past 2 months, I've been playing a little game called Destiny 2. I've never really been into grindy loot hunting games. I think my passion died with Diablo 2 back when I was a kid, though to be honest, I had unfinished business with the Destiny franchise. I quit in 2018 prior to the Forsaken expansion, and even before that, I honestly barely scratched the surface. So it was time to give Destiny 2 another shot, especially as I had heard the game had gotten a lot better over time. I also thought it'd be a good thought experiment, a guy who prefers compact, linear experiences, forced to play a huge, never-ending game with very little direction. And after 250 hours played, even though I have a lot to criticize, I ended up enjoying Destiny 2 a lot more than I thought I would. One of your first questions to any YouTuber should be, does this person actually play this game because he wants to, or just because he's covering it? It's not always easy to stick it out with a game you're not into. If you do, you might not be in the best mental state to critique the game. It's also hard to drop it when it's your job and you've already invested some time into it. It's sort of a sunk cost situation, you know what I mean? So a lot of the time, you might end up watching someone play a game or cover it who isn't into it 100%. And it should say a lot about Destiny 2 when I say I play this game on a daily basis for hours at a time just for fun. However, this isn't how it always was. I had a pretty miserable time for the first few weeks learning Destiny 2, and I can now best sum up by saying Destiny 2 is rewarding for veteran players, but probably one of the hardest games to get into for anyone who isn't. Firstly, it's a very mystifying endeavor just to try to buy this game and understand how to play, or frankly what this game even is. D2 is a free-to-play game. Technically, and I gotta praise Bungie, they give you a lot of content here. There are some bounties and quests and activities you can't do, and some places you can't go, but a large portion of the game is up for grabs. You'll never get to the end game or reach the highest power level, but you can try a lot of things, and it's shocking this day and age to see a game this generous, especially without microtransactions shoved down your throat from the get-go. Destiny 2 does have the Eververse trading store, which is for money, but it only sells cosmetics. I think Bungie was confident in the gameplay they offered, so they were liberal with their offerings in the free-to-play system, and I really appreciate the ability to try out a game before I buy it and get a good feel for what I'm about to purchase. However, the process itself ends up being very confusing because Bungie has handled the new player experience just flat out terribly. Firstly, it's important to understand that the original Destiny 2 story and its first few expansions have been vaulted. And when I say vaulted, I mean removed from the game. The reason for this was to ensure the game could be continually added to without imploding from within like a dying star about to burst in outer space. As a shared world, it's important that the game runs well, obviously, and having 5 years worth of planets and content is apparently what would bottleneck the game. So they removed the original Red War campaign, which was the original story, as well as the preceding stories in these expansions. And man, let me tell you, without these expansions and campaigns, playing Destiny 2 today is so confusing as it makes understanding the story basically impossible. You begin the game by selecting a character class, which by the way, kudos to Bungie for developing some of the coolest art in any space-themed video game. The classes, weapons, armor, spells, skyboxes, and environments are flat out incredible looking, and the overall style of the game is slick, despite overly complicated menus and crazy long load times. The campaign starts afterwards with a short cutscene where you briefly learn about the Traveler, the Darkness, and the Guardians. This is all fine and dandy, but it doesn't really tell you much, and certainly nothing related to important characters. In the game proper now, you awake next to a ghost who tells you that you need to get to the city for some reason and talk to a guy named Zavala for some reason. So you meet up with this guy named Shah Han, whom you know nothing about, and he sends you to some random boring quests, while a bunch of people, places, and things are dumped on you as you try to figure out what on earth is happening. 3 hours later, you get to the tower, wherein you walk through an empty city and introduce yourself to a bunch of NPCs. It's pretty dry. And that's it. That's your story. At this point, it's up to you to figure everything else out. Where to go, what to do, the lore, reputations, backstories, character relationships, quest structure, heroes, villains, progression, transmog system, seasonal content, bounties, triumphs, various game systems like weapon mods, enemy buff counters like barrier and overload, infusions, upgrading, crafting, game currencies, what the various items in your inventory are for, bounties, dailies, weeklies, and a whole hell of a lot more. I hate to to be immediately negative in this video as I try to find the light in my gaming experiences these days, but this is by far one of the worst new player experiences I have ever had to sit through. It's frustrating because once you learn Destiny 2, it becomes a very fun game. It seriously took me days upon days of research just to figure out what was happening and also just what to buy. I had to get on the phone with various friends, look up YouTube videos and archived Reddit posts. It's ridiculous. Just buying the game can send you in a tailspin as well, as you confront a store page that has over 10 different options for buying the game and a price tag for the full game that exceeds $220. I mean, am I playing a game or trying to solve the Da Vinci Code here? Bungie's grave mistake has been a failure to streamline their monetization. We have expansions, expansion bundles, seasons, dungeon passes, the 30th anniversary pack, and 3 different versions of the current expansion, which alone is enough confusion to scare away people from the game. And every year the model changes, as you can't be sure how much they'll charge in the future or what they'll cut out to which you may have already bought. Not to mention, Bungie still sells the Forsaken pack even though they have removed the campaign, which is flat out yucky and disconcerting. And when you finally get in, you're thrown to the wolves, in the middle of a franchise that has been on rails for nearly 10 years, with a game company that doesn't seem to care if you have any clue about the game you're actually playing. One of the things I remember about my limited time with Destiny 2 back in 2018 was the Red War campaign, which wasn't perfect, but at least it did a pretty good job explaining the story, the mechanics, and the Destiny history and all the important figures. It's really a shame it's been replaced by a disjointed mess of quests that offer essentially zero context to anything going on, while doing a pretty piss-poor job explaining the various game systems. Destiny 2 is a great game deep down, with extremely fun mechanics and an original take on the FPS genre, far enough removed from Halo to make it stand on its own. But the structure of the game is broken. I think it would have been a good idea to create a button in the main menu called Campaign. They could have put all of the main story campaigns in here so you could play through the old content and have a proper campaign experience. They could have even put them in an instance format so they wouldn't have to add all the old planets back to the galaxy map. You could just click the campaign you want and poof, there you go. And if it was still a problem, they could remove co-op and even cut out redundant missions if capacity was an issue. If there's a will, there's a way. If not, at least create a 5 to 10 minute cinematic story scene and replace the existing introduction. Zavala introduces the Traveler and what happened to it, how the Guardians defeated the enemy, then this happened, then that, so on and so forth, while introducing all of the key characters like the Drifter, Osiris, the life and death of Cayde 6, Ikora, and Zavala himself. Then you could drop them off at the beginning of the New Light quest with some knowledge in the back of their pocket. And then you use Shahan to teach the various game systems. I mean, that seems like a no-brainer to me. Bungie is a $2 billion company. I think they can afford to create better tutorials and in-game resources for players. The optimist in me hopes that one day they replace New Lights with a proper AAA fleshed out campaign. Because honestly, the entire thing is pretty bad. Some would argue that a game that focuses on loot shouldn't really care about its story. I mean, I highly doubt we played Diablo 2 as kids because we cared about the Dark Wanderer or Bale. We wanted fun gameplay and loot, right? Times have changed though, and games have come a long way, haven't they? And it's been proven that we can have it all with games if companies spend enough earnest time on them. The frustrating part about it all is that Destiny 2 actually has a great story. It's just buried underneath a very large, murky, dark ocean. It took me a long time to piece it together and far too much outside research. When your best course of action to learn about a game is to head to a Wikipedia, you know someone's done something pretty wrong. But once unveiled, Destiny 2 is actually pretty deep and interesting. There is a shocking amount of lore and backstories and characters, and it's pretty fascinating to learn how everything comes together. Not having a defined ending is certainly a downside to this kind of game, but if the story continues in the quality of the Witch Queen campaign, it is only going to get better. It's just really so sad to think a story of this quality and scale is so obfuscated, simply because a game company doesn't understand that a new player experience is as important as the retaining of its existing player base. You have to assume it's a decision made by someone in a very expensive suit that likely doesn't work on the development team. If you spend a bunch of money on new players whom you don't know will stick around or not, you don't have any guarantees your investment will pay off. This may be the very reason why the new player experience in Destiny 2 is terrible. And frankly, I don't know if they consider half of what they should be doing even for their longtime fans, evident by the vaulting and sunsetting of content people have actually already paid for. Are the implications worth it? Not only are we screwing paid customers, we're also jeopardizing the onboarding of new players, one in which story experiences are zapped thin. When Crow talks about his regrets with Cayde 6, when Zavala gets emotional over his family, when the witness was revealed, or when characters talk about people, villains, heroes from a distant past. I simply stare at my screen with an empty feeling like I've missed out. Not because I did anything wrong, but because the game put me in this state of ignorance. And playing through a game where you feel like you're simply going through the motions is a very sad feeling. Despite it all though, Destiny 2 eventually hooked me. Around the 75-hour mark, I was absolutely addicted to this looter shooter, because when you finally get past all the fog and the unnecessary monetization, there is a great game here. Destiny 2 is actually a fairly deep and engrossing game, at least for a game of this type. There's a lot of nuance built into the perks, the abilities, the upgrading, and the economics of the game. The build crafting aspect of the game is really fun as well. Finding the perfect god roll for a weapon is not exactly stimulating gameplay. It gives people something to do, but it's also very grindy. But collecting cool guns, exotics, and creating loadouts for all the subclasses, giving different challenges like Master Lost Sectors or PvP was really fun. It has a very addictive quality to it, which is obviously why these games do well. I have to commend the gunplay as well. It's some of the best in the biz, which helps keep some of the grindier aspects of the game bearable. The combination of great weapon handling, a jetpack system, spells, slides, melee, grenades, and supers is something pretty unique to Destiny 2. Many games have some of these elements, few if any have them all. Mechanically, everything feels buttery smooth and satisfying, from the hefty weight to the guns, the crushing supers, and the crunchy melee kills. I can't really describe it because it's sort of a physical thing, but there's also this sense of flow and mastery to this game. A lot of the appeal of an FPS is the feeling that you can gain mastery, and when you do, the game sort of almost plays in slow motion. It's this feeling like your hands are sort of weightless, floating across your keyboard, or your controller. And I have to say, the more you play Destiny 2, the more special it feels, and I can only attribute that to the excellent handling and mechanics. What I'm alluding to is the skill ceiling, which the game has a high one, which is great for players who invest a lot of time into the game. However, Destiny 2 also has a low skill floor, which is a great combination, wherein anyone can pick up and play the game and have fun, but advanced players have plenty of tools they can use to get an advantage. We're talking about things like ADS sliding and advanced movements to utilizing jet boost timing for extra speed. Or just the classic one, which is to bait someone around a corner as you jetpack directly above the doorway. Most players won't be looking up when they round the corner. My favorite mechanic is what I call the sword peek. Because Destiny 2 has both third and first person combat perspectives, you can utilize the field of view to get a competitive advantage. With the sword peek, you'll swap to a sword which puts you in third person. You then position yourself behind an object and pivot the camera to see around the corner that you wouldn't normally be able to. You can even use this technique to see over and above terrain. You see a lot of Titans do this with their shields, but all you need is a sword, ironically with no ammo. Pop the sword, track your target, and react accordingly. It's a great way to get the jump on people, and better yet, counter annoying shotgun sliders.
It's a power play.
However, Destiny 2 is still a game in which you do the same stuff over and over, and that is going to be a deal breaker for many people. The grind for gear and power is quite a lonely affair if you play by yourself, and endlessly breaking down useless gear, farming the same activities 50 times in a row, and queuing up for activities just because a bounty told you to do so can make you feel sort of robotic in a way. It gets repetitive and results in a big feeling of FOMO. I actually think this is one of the game's weaknesses because it can have an adverse effect on people simply enjoying the game. If they think they're getting behind because they don't want to grind, they'll get stung by a fear of missing out. I appreciate the seasonal and bounty system as it gives players a reason to do certain things. This was a huge improvement from year one, and from a position of populating low player count modes like Gambit, it just simply makes sense, but in my opinion, this is the fastest way to burn out. Don't treat Destiny 2 like a job. Many people don't find repetition very appetizing, normally myself too, and I have to assume people either love or hate this game because of it. The best way to play Destiny 2, in my opinion, is to ignore the aspects of the game that push you towards things for the sake of simply numbers, which is unfortunately a lot of it. For example, getting 50 kills in Team Scorch. That's not something I want to do, and I wouldn't recommend doing it just because the game tells you you should do it for experience. Logging in each Tuesday only to feel like you have to do each weekly yellow bubble makes the game feel like the chore it shouldn't be. When I started to play for pure fun, Destiny 2 quickly became my go-to game. I dearly wish the game leaned more into the explorative side of things inside the planets. I like that kind of adventure, naturally. But I found out that's not exactly what Destiny 2 is or wants to be, and judging a game based off what I want from it perhaps isn't fair. The conversation of solo versus group play though is something that needs to be had, because playing Destiny by yourself is almost a completely different game than if you have a full fire team. Here's the thing, unless you have friends, you're not going to be raiding in Destiny 2, period. You can try and find a Sherpa on a Discord group, but at that point you're going outside the game space when the accommodations might have been better put inside of it. Unfortunately, it's almost impossible to provide challenging raids and ensure everyone has access to them. It's a catch-22 because people should have to put in the effort, but the thing is, you can put all of the effort you want into Destiny 2. You simply need teammates. So team content puts a very hard roadblock in place that if you have friends, you can do the content, and if you don't, you cannot. You can try to solo a dungeon, but that's hard. If you're not willing to use Destiny LFG inside a browser and group with complete strangers, you're not going to be doing those dungeons. Especially raids, as they have boss fights that flat out require multiple people. Mechanics are present to prevent people from completing them solo. Destiny 2 isn't unlike other MMOs that have content that can't be beaten without the aid of other players, and Bungie has decided to not provide in-game matchmaking for its hardest forms of content. For solo players, this seems like it flat out sucks, though if we're playing devil's advocate, Bungie would have had to dumb down the difficulty if they introduced a raid and a dungeon matchmaking system. Because that would drop down the overall skill level required significantly, that might not have been a good idea. Other MMOs though get around this by providing multiple raid difficulties like World of Warcraft. It's not a perfect system, but at least gives players access to all the content. One of the more interesting conversations I had when playing was with a buddy of mine who's been playing Destiny 2 since release. He literally has 1,500 hours clocked, and I asked him how the raids and dungeons were at one point. I was surprised to hear he's never done a dungeon or a raid, and when I asked him why, he simply said, "I don't have anyone to play with." It struck a chord then, but only continued to grow on me as I found myself in the exact situation he had been in a few weeks later. I really wanted to raid and dungeon, but I literally had no one online to do so with. So I tried using the LFG tool online, but I was met with some extremely rude players who immediately kicked me out of the group. I mean, I can't blame them, I didn't know what I was doing, but all the same, I'm not willing to jump into some random Discord group and God forbid talk to some rando kid just so I can raid. This is a problem because a lot of people are very shy and don't like forced social situations, especially in a game where they're trying to chill out and have some fun with. It presents a very big problem as it divides the Destiny 2 player base into groups, those who use mics and those who don't. And if you don't, you likely won't be doing any of the top content. The really ironic part though is that Destiny 2 isn't actually a social experience even though it calls itself an MMO. The entire game revolves around playing socially with each other, but not interacting in any social way. Stop and think about that for a second. There's no trading, no one at any point ever talks in the chat box, and you never ever have to work with anyone unless you're in a raid. At that point though, you're already in a Discord server with someone. The tower, the game's hub, has people in it. You see them coming and going and walking around, but they might as well just be NPCs. It's the weirdest thing to see, coming from a WoW background where all the major cities are ripe with chatter and trade. When you go into a strike, your fire team just zips towards the objective and skips everything they possibly can. You kill the boss and you never see them again. No one ever talks. I mean, this is a game where you can get clan rewards by being in a clan and never talking or doing anything with anyone in your clan. At no point is any social element required or even encouraged. And that is something to note because teaming up with friends doing the same activity you would have been doing by yourself is always way more fun. This really adds to the disparity of how people probably experience this game. You're either playing what appears to be essentially a single player game masquerading as a social one, or you're in a Discord server with other people actually talking. These are two completely different experiences, but they're in the same game. And as such, given the new player experience being thoroughly appalling, I would actually be hesitant to recommend Destiny 2 if you don't have a couple buddies to play with. I'm not harping on this because I'm saying Destiny 2 is bad because not social. I'm simply saying that the experience you're going to have is completely dependent on what kind of camp you happen to be in. And for me, I was able to do one raid and one raid only because I had a friend willing to drag me into his group. After that though, I never did a raid again. It was really fun and I wanted to do more, I just couldn't. So if you're a solo player like me, that leaves you with doing strikes and nightfalls with randoms, lost sectors, or PvP. While I'm primarily a PvP player, I have to admit the Crucible is ungodly oppressive for new players. The matchmaking is just terrible, which is a shame because this is some of the best first-person PvP out there. While light levels are normalized, new players are at an inherent disadvantage with weapons, gear, mods, and upgrades. Yes, you compete if you know what you're doing, but the disparity remains. It wouldn't be so bad if the game had a proper matchmaking system, but it doesn't. As far as I can tell, there is no skill-based matchmaking in this game. It seems like the game just searches for 12 players with similar connection speeds, and only then tries to balance the teams afterwards. It does this by matching the player with the highest MMR with the player with the lowest MMR in order to create an average. This results with one team with one really good player and 5 shitters, and one team that is around the same skill level, yet overall much higher than the average MMR of the other team since it's skewed. The cost to this system is A, the best player has to carry the shitters, and B, the shitters get dominated by people that are inherently better than them. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but this is what I experienced on a daily basis playing Destiny 2 over the course of the past 2 months. And you have to wonder why they don't just implement skill-based matchmaking prior to finding those 12 available players. Though I guess obviously we know the reason, because faster matchmaking results. Still, I would highly recommend the Crucible as it is very, very fun. The truth is, Destiny 2 is a very fun game that is highly flawed. It has fantastic gameplay mechanics, the shooting is great, the PvP suite is fantastic, the cutscenes are of the highest quality, bosses are for the most part great, though can we stop with the endless immune shielding and transporting to other dimensions just so we can stretch out the playtime, please? And most of the climactic story moments are excellent if you've been around long enough to understand what the hell is going on. Destiny 2 doesn't exactly give me what I want from this type of game, but that's not to say it's bad by any means. I actually really enjoy the game, despite some huge flaws like complicated monetization, not being able to access all the content as a solo player, the awful new player experience, and the horrendous PvP matchmaking. It's also an incredibly grindy game too, and drives you to the point of insanity at times. I mean, anyone who's ever tried to complete the stasis quest has walked down this icy room literally 50 times, and that gets so fucking old. Destiny 2 is bloated, it has way too much backtracking, it recycles so much content, and it has so few enemies. But the gameplay is just supreme. The weapon design and variety is fantastic, and the mechanics feel terrific. It's one of those games where the more you play, the more you get out of it, which is why it also feels very discouraging when you can't keep up with its seasonal pace. Years down the road, Destiny 2 is a lot better than it was. In fact, I would say it's a very addictive game. Even with its huge flaws, it's still very well made, and you should give it a shot if you enjoy loot shooters. Though in all honesty, it's not going to convert you if you're not.